Caesar Act is the fresh batch of economic sanctions imposed by the United States of America on the war-torn Syria in a bid to increase pressure on the Damascus government, which is scoring victories against foreign-backed terrorists. But how did the Caesar Act come to be? On 20 January 2014, 2 days before negotiations about the Syrian conflict were scheduled to begin in Switzerland, a sensational report burst onto television and front pages around the world. The story was that a former Syrian army photographer had 55,000 photographs documenting the torture and killing of 11,000 detainees by the Syrian security establishment. The Syrian photographer was given the code name Caesar. The story became known as the Caesar torture photos. The photographs are in the custody of an opposition organization called the Syrian Association for Missing and Conscious Detainees. In 2015, they allowed Human Rights Watch to study all the photographs, which have otherwise been secret. In December 2015, Human Rights Watch released a report titled "If the Dead Could Speak." The biggest revelation was that over 46% of the photographs, which is 24,568, do not show people tortured to death by the Syrian government. On the contrary, they show dead Syrian soldiers and victims of car bombs and other violence. Thus, nearly half the photos show the opposite of what was alleged. These photos, never revealed to the public, confirm that the Syrian opposition is violent and has killed large number of Syrian security forces and civilians. Many questions arise from Caesar's photos. The most important are questions about the true identity of the Caesar. Fast forward to December 2019, the Caesar Syria Civilian Protection Act was born as a centerpiece of efforts by anti-Syrian government opposition members who reside outside Syria and who most probably have witnessed nothing of the global terrorism against their country throughout the past 9 years. This is not new though. This is typical in the CIA's regime change book. From the Kuwait baby incubators to Iraq's yellow cake uranium to the Libyan army's women raping stories. This is the US's last resort for regime change in Syria, and Syrians already see through it. Welcome to the Mideastream. I'm Marwa Osman. The United States has imposed new sanctions on the war-torn Syria in a bid to increase pressure on the Damascus government, which is scoring victories against foreign-backed militants. As these U.S. sanctions are directed against Syrian people and violate all possible international rules, Syria decided to resist the sanction pressures as persistently as it does with terrorism. To discuss this issue with us from Sydney is Dr. Tim Anderson, author and professor at Sydney University. I want to thank you very much for being with us. Tim, now to dive into the topic with the new travel restrictions and financial sanctions imposed by the U.S. under the so-called Caesar Act can freeze the assets of anyone dealing with the Damascus government, regardless of their nationality, and it targets many more sectors. The U.S. and the European Union had already imposed a lot of economic sanctions on Damascus already, freezing the assets of the states and hundreds of other firms and individuals in Syria. How is this act any different from the previous economic sanctions?
I think it's right that there's a very serious blockade has been on Syria since 2012. So in a sense, it doesn't add much to that except that it targets third parties. So once again, the US is trying to use this extraterritorial power that it has, mainly through control of the US dollar and the financial system, until that changes. And I think the main targets are allies they regard as weak. There are some European countries that have been making overtures to Syria. There's two Gulf states, Kuwait and the UAE, that have re-established relations with Damascus, and they're involved in investing in the country. So what the US is trying to do is discipline or to control its weak allies and therefore enhance the blockade.
Well, Tim, despite the fact that these sanctions will deny the Syrian people access to key medicine, to other vital goods and services, we see the Western governments and the human rights institutions across the world actually hailing these sanctions instead of calling for the US to stop bullying nations that don't particularly agree with the foreign policy of the US. How much longer do you think such a system is going to be viable?
It's going to be viable so long as people are very divided. If small countries are isolated against these sorts of pressures, and if there are no other options, that is to say, until, say, China has a new financial architecture in place through a leap in technology into new blockchain technology, for example, isolated countries are going to remain very vulnerable. The only possibility is those isolated countries come together. And we have seen the beginnings of that, for example, through the exchange between Iran and Venezuela, the tanker exchange, and the recent new ship that's arrived with food and refinery spares and so on. That sort of cooperation is the way in which this sort of pressure can be ameliorated, let's say.
Do you think civilians in Syria, for example, have the capability to wait for such options to happen?
The civilians in Syria are depending entirely on their government, which, for example, is now placed top priority on food security, that is to say, on procuring sufficient grain, either from Syrian harvests or from elsewhere to feed its people. This is a genocidal assault on the Syrian people. It's attempting to starve them to submission, basically. But the immediate recourse is that the government is doing all in its power to try and, in the first instance, establish food sovereignty.
Well, Tim, its currency, the Syrian currency, has plunged by 70% since April 2020, and more than half of its people face food scarcity, especially after the US burned down thousands of acres of crops belonging to the Syrian civilians. Syria seems barely able to absorb new shocks, and now we have new US sanctions that could devastate what is actually left of the flatlining economy to begin with because of the 9-year-old global war against Syria. What do you think are the options left for the Syrian government to try and maybe save what is left of the economy?
Well, you know that Syria, over a long period of time, sanctions have been in place in one form or another for a much longer time, it's very long war. And Syria's response has been to achieve a degree of self-sufficiency in a wide range of things. Food is an important central one of those things, but also in lots of other areas, Syria has prided itself on self-sufficiency. Iran also, and of course, a fair degree of self-sufficiency is important, or at least collaboration with neighbours in terms of getting through these sorts of crises. There isn't any other option really in the short term. In the medium term, we're looking at a shift in international systems, but in the short term, there has to be self-sufficiency options. That's really the only way that they can weather the storm.
Well, Tim, the Caesar sanctions definitely have the potential to be a big deal for the entire region, not only for Syria, because the U.S. is using them to, according to what the U.S. even said, to deter countries from doing business with Syria, especially Lebanon, Iraq, Iran, Russia, and China. Now, knowing that each country has its own set of challenges here, will Lebanon, for one, be able actually to fight off these sanctions or at least just dodge them?
I don't think there's any possibility for Lebanon alone to fight them. They have to join together with some of the other states there. There are the possibilities of cooperation with Syria, possibility of cooperating with Iraq, with Iran, for example. Isolated, it's going to be extremely difficult. And Lebanon hasn't had the advantage that Iran and Syria have had of having this emphasis on self-sufficiency because Lebanon's been so trade-oriented, basically. So Lebanon is suffering particularly because of that. It was integrated into the international system, and it's now being attacked by that system. And the problem is, of course, one of the internal politics of the country, but really the immediate option there is to try and look at things like food and energy, for example, with the neighbours that are under similar attack. What other options are available in the short term?
Well, Tim, we briefly, before we ended off here, we did hear the Secretary General of Hezbollah, the Islamic Resistance in Lebanon, threatening both the US and Israel if they continue to suffocate both the Syrian and the Lebanese people. There will have to come a time when the resistance will have to retaliate. How do you think that this kind of speech coming from the resistance was taken by both the US and the Israeli regimes, and do you think that they will be affected by it in any way?
Well, immediately no, because action is going to speak louder than words in this context. You know, they are, of course, the Israeli regime is completely behind this. That the obsession with Iran is precisely because Iran is the largest independent state there, and with the support of Iran, some of the other states have survived. Syria has survived because it's got strong allies in Iran, for example, and also Russia. So that's why I say those bonds and the cooperation between the countries that are facing similar pressures is absolutely essential. And the main thing that the US is trying to do with this Caesar sanctions is try and destroy those bonds, try and prevent cooperation between Lebanon and Syria, between Iran and Iraq, between Iran and Syria, for example. And that's why the only response can be for looking for relief and looking for future options by strengthening those bonds. But remaining isolated is a certain path for defeat.
Well, to end off with the current Caesar Act bullying by the United States, it seems that they have come to the final edge of their rhetoric against the government in Damascus. After the Caesar Act, do you expect that the US will turn on to more sanctions if it is even possible, or maybe just try some sort of a diplomatic dialogue for a change?
Well, I think you're right. It is an act of desperation because effectively the US has been losing in Syria for quite a long time, and it knows that it's losing. But it's doing this type of scorched earth, spiteful approach, trying to punish the Syrian people as much as possible. And they're not really sensitive to the pleas that they're hurting people. They're hurting a whole population. This is a genocidal policy, and they know that, and that they want to cause that sort of harm and create desperation and perhaps try and incite some sort of surrender. But it's a desperate ploy when they know that they've been losing for some time. So it's really aimed to punish. And I think that there's nothing much more that they can do there. Look what's happened with Venezuela. They tried 3 times coups. They tried to assassinate Maduro. They put out rewards on his head. They've imposed very severe sanctions there too, which Iran is now helping Venezuela with. So, and then at the end of that, Trump just recently said, oh, maybe I'll talk to Maduro. I mean, this has been his method, try and bully, threaten, hector, incite violence, and then try and cut a deal. But he's run out of options there. He's run out of goodwill too. So I don't think there's anything more that they can do with Venezuela. There's nothing more that they can do with Syria. But of course, those countries have to survive in the meantime while new relationships are built.
Well, I want to thank you very much, Dr. Tim Anderson, author of The Dirty War on Syria and the Axis of Resistance Towards an Independent Middle East. Thank you very much for joining us to discuss the Caesar Act, terrorism against the people in Syria. Please stay tuned with us. We will talk more about Yemen. Yemeni civilians are again being targeted by the Saudi-led coalition airstrikes in northern Yemen. The US-backed aggression force launched dozens of air raids on 4 provinces across the country throughout last week. Meanwhile, at least 80% of the 28 million strong population is now reliant on aid to survive in what the United Nations has called the world's worst humanitarian crisis. Yemeni capital under attack in this following report. Sana'a shook to its core last week as the Yemeni capital was struck by the heaviest Saudi airstrikes in years. Residents of the Yemeni capital were left terrified after airstrikes shattered a period of relative calm. It was around 6:45 a.m. on Tuesday, June 16, when Sana'a residents woke up to an earth-shattering airstrike that targeted Al Nahdain mountain in the middle of Sana'a. Coalition warplanes had been hovering over Sana'a and other provinces almost constantly since a day before and had targeted several areas around the capital, such as Al Nahdain Mountain, Attan Mountain, and the Aviation College. A hardly observed coronavirus ceasefire expired last month, but Sana'a residents were nonetheless shocked to see the return of heavy bombing. On Thursday, June 18, the Yemeni Al Masira TV channel said 77 airstrikes had targeted several provinces in Yemen in 24 hours, including Sana'a, Sada, Amran, Al Bayda, Hajja, Ma'rib, and Al Jawf. One of those hit was a vehicle in Sada province, killing 13 civilians, including 4 children, sparking international condemnation. The attack happened the same day as the Saudi-led coalition, which is primarily made up of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates forces, was removed from the UN's Children and Armed Conflict Reports blacklist for the first time in 3 years. Muhammad Ali al-Houthi, the chairman of the Supreme Revolutionary Committee of Yemen, strongly condemned the UN decision to take the Saudi-led coalition waging war on Yemen off a global blacklist for killing and injuring children in the conflict-plagued Arab country. The move prompted immediate protests from human rights groups worldwide. Joe Becker, the advocacy director of the Children's Rights Division at Human Rights Watch, argued that Guterres is adding a new level of shame to his list of shame by removing the Saudi-led coalition and ignoring the UN's own evidence of continued grave violations against children. By removing the Saudi-led coalition from global blacklist, the UN Secretary General sends the message that powerful actors can get away with killing children anywhere in the world, not only in Yemen. To discuss this topic with us from Sydney is Jay Therapel, who is member of the Yemeni Solidarity Council. Thank you very much for joining us, Jay. Now, as we just heard in this following report, Saudi Arabia stepped up its aggression against Yemen, where the Western-backed Saudi coalition forces has been criticized for commonly targeting civilians and mostly children in the Yemeni country. Yet, ironically, the UN pulled the Saudi-led coalition from its blacklist of groups violating children's rights. I have really one question for this one. Why would they pull them out of this blacklist?
The answer is that the UN cannot really be an impartial institution because it relies on funding from the same countries that it's supposed to condemn when they commit human rights atrocities. So, for example, the US will threaten to cut off funding to the UN if it includes Israel on its blacklist. That's a pretty well-known example. This has been going on for years. So back in 2016, the UN, under the leadership of Ban Ki-moon, included Saudi Arabia on a list of countries that had killed or at least severely injured children in conflict. So the Saudis retaliated by saying that they would leave the United Nations and convince other Arab and Muslim nations to do the same. The UN then capitulated to Saudi Arabia by removing them from that list of human rights violators. And the same thing has happened this year, so there's really nothing new here. Ultimately, this genocidal war against Yemen is being committed with the blessings of the United Nations. That's the real problem, because according to Resolution 2216, the Saudi-led coalition is starving millions of Yemenis on behalf of the Yemeni government. So this is a UN-sanctioned genocide because Russia and China did not veto that resolution. Had they done so, at least this war would be declared illegal according to the UN.
Well, Jay, the leader of the Yemen's Ansarullah revolutionary movement, Sayyid Abdul Malik al-Houthi, warned Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates last week, just as they were bombing Sana'a. He warned them against attempts to normalize relations with the Israeli regime. Now, to the Western audience, this might be a bit confusing as to why would Yemen care if a rapprochement happened between Saudi Arabia, UAE on one side and Israel on the other. How would you explain this kind of a stance coming from the leader of the Yemeni revolutionary movement?
Well, you're referring to the speech delivered last Thursday by Sayyid Abdul Malik al-Houthi. He argued that the two main threats to the Muslim world are the United States and Israel, which is of course a reference to the logo, the famous logo of Ansarullah. This is a stance that Ansarullah has consistently advocated since January 2002. So according to the speech, he said Saudi Arabia and the UAE are siding with Israel, which is the chief enemy of the Muslim world, end quote. At the very least, it appears as though the US, Israel, the Saudis, and the UAE are on the same team. But from the perspective of the Yemeni national resistance, it goes further. They would argue that these two Gulf states in particular have essentially sold themselves to the US-Israeli alliance, thereby subordinating themselves to the US-Israeli goal, which is to crush any independent nations in the region. So I'll give you a few examples. Last year in March, it was revealed that around 200 Yemeni religious leaders and public figures who opposed the foreign occupation of their country were assassinated by US and Israeli mercenaries who had been contracted by the Emiratis, the UAE. According to Yemeni military sources, in September last year, British and Israeli warplanes were taking part in bombing raids against Yemen, killing dozens of civilians. And to give you an example of long-term Saudi-Israeli plans, as we speak, Israel is working with Saudi Arabia and Jordan to build railway lines connecting the Red Sea with the Mediterranean. So we've seen dramatic changes. Within the space of 16 years, within my lifetime that is, the Saudis have gone from aiding Hamas to freezing their assets. Back in 2003, Hamas was thanking Saudi Arabia for their financial support. But from 2014 onwards, Saudi Arabia has effectively banned Hamas as a terrorist organization. And last year in September, the Saudis began arresting Hamas members in their country for raising money, which brings up something which is really ironic. I mean, it's in this context that Sayyid Abdul Malik al-Houthi asks the question, he says, who would have imagined that the Palestinian would be a prisoner of the Saudi regime because of his hostility to Israel?
Jay, taken from all of this narrative that you gave to us, which we would never hear in a mainstream media outlet, whoever it is, the Ansarullah leader also censored enemies' efforts to portray a distorted image of ongoing developments in the region by means of their media outlets, by arguing that the Western countries are acting in favor of Israeli lobby groups. What do you agree with that? I would for sure know that you would agree with that, but how do you think that, for example, your country's mainstream media has been handling the Yemeni war, for example?
The Australian media simply does not talk about Yemen to anywhere near the degree that would reflect the seriousness of the humanitarian crisis on the ground. In fact, I would say that my job would be a lot easier if the media aggressively demonized Sayyid Abdul Malik al-Houthi the way they demonized, for example, Bashar al-Assad in Syria. That way, at least people like myself would be attacked by the media, thereby giving me a platform to publicly advocate for Yemen. So you mentioned Israeli lobby groups. So the fact is that Australia, unfortunately, is not an independent country. We lost our independence in 1975 when the CIA dismissed our democratically elected prime minister. And ever since then, the narrative in this country has been dominated by Rupert Murdoch and his press, because he owns around 90% of the mass media in this country, and he's pro-Israel anyway. So in Australia, there are perhaps a dozen organizations that work closely with Israel to exert influence over Australian political life. So, for example, they take politicians and journalists on all expenses paid trips to occupied Palestine. Also, our former Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, even suggested in his book that the Israeli lobby played a role in removing him from power after he took action against the Israeli embassy for using Australian passports to carry out assassinations against Hamas in Dubai, in the UAE. And he's someone who himself identifies as being pro-Israel. Back to Yemen, the problem with the way our media portrays Yemen comes down to the framing. Because according to UN Resolution 2216, which I mentioned before, the media can get away with presenting the conflict as Saudi Arabia acting on behalf of the so-called legitimate government against the Houthi rebels, even though this is grossly misinterpreting the situation on the ground, where the only 100% Yemeni force is the Ansarullah-backed government based in the capital, Sana'a. So finally, what's missing is really the voice of the organized Muslim diaspora, not just in Australia, but across the West. So here, I think there's been a shift. So but previously, they used to prioritize.
My problem with the mainstream media is that even by now, when it has become very clear that Saudi Arabia and its allies have not won, they lost the war in Yemen, and they urgently need to have an exit strategy, yet we see the mainstream media still hailing this as some sort of a liberate Yemen war. But the coronavirus pandemic provided some sort of an exit strategy, or maybe a convenient opportunity to save face by declaring, for example, an end to hostilities on humanitarian grounds, if they could. I know they couldn't, but yet they continued their aggression. What possibly could they be still targeting that they have not even bombed yet?
It seems like no matter how many airstrikes the Saudis, Emiratis, Americans, British and Israelis launch against the forces of the Yemeni national resistance, it seems no matter how many mercenaries they throw at the Yemeni people, the front lines simply are not moving. Not only is this because of the determination of the resistance, but also because it's impossible for the Saudi occupation forces to make any advances on the ground because they lack the mercenaries to do so. Saudi Arabia needs oil to be at $80 a barrel to break even on their government's budget, which is why they've asked their government departments to slash their budgets by 20 to 30%. And their attempt to raise capital by selling shares in Aramco hasn't generated the returns they were hoping for. If the Yemeni resistance launches another drone strike on Saudi Arabia's oil facilities at a time like this, the Yemenis, that is, they may be declaring victory very soon.
Well, I want to thank you very much, Jay Therapel, member of the Yemeni Solidarity Council, for joining us from Sydney to talk about what is happening inside of Yemen. Thank you very much for joining us. And please stay tuned next week for more from our show, the Mideastream.